just grab a pew anywhere that you wish as I introduce our panel on this data-driven regulation. Jacqui Ellis, General Manager, Data Insights and Intel at MB, Michael Howden, Data and Insights Manager at Taumata Arawhai, and Puti Wilson, Principal Advisor, Māori, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Big hand for the three. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Same rules as before on this one, members of the audience. You're not shy. Dive in here. You can put comments in. You can put questions in at any point, and we'll just process them in the ordinary way. We've had a lot about water this morning, and I'm sort of, in my English literature phase, I've got Milton on the desk, of course. I've got, I think it's Coleridge or someone who took far too much morphine for non-medical purposes. Water, water everywhere, but none of it to drink. What about data, data everywhere, but none of it to think? Because it needs somebody to sort of work on it, to interlink it to regulation, doesn't it? I mean, how critical is the relevance of the relationship between data to the business of regulation, I guess, in your roles and agencies? Michael, I'll kick off with you.
Well, it's kind of interesting following on from your CE because he steals some of your stories, but I can probably dig into some of the examples he gave this morning. I think probably first, it's the 21st century, so to ignore data would be somewhat foolish. But at the same time, in my role as Data Insights Manager, to assume that data is critical and everyone's on board with it is probably also a little bit foolish. I know that some regulators out there are much more likely to trust their intuition than a bunch of numbers that I put up on a dashboard. So I think holding that balance is really important. I guess just one example is just diving down on the story that Bill told this morning about the analysis that we did, looking at some geospatial evidence around how many unregistered water supplies there might be out there. So that number went from 5,000 to 75,000. But just knowing that number is only sort of the start of the process, and so how can we use data to then lead into our engagement with those unregistered suppliers and work out who has those relationships? Because data can be the start, but really when it comes to regulation, relationships are also key, as I'm sure all of you know.
And I think this is going to be an interesting one. And again, members of the audience, don't be shy in coming to us with the points about the interrelationship where you work. Is data or the use of it a sort of an unruly horse? Are there any kind of assumptions that are hard-coded into your systems that make you think about matters differently? Same question played to Michael, to yourself, Jacqui.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the really key things, just to segue from that presentation, is about preparing us for the future at systems level. How can we forecast and plan for future scenarios that are really quite different than what we've experienced in the past? A number of our data sets across the government agencies are historic. They only tell you about the past. They're designed to operate around historical control levers, and they represent cohorts of people in ways that are not how we want to kind of take forward into the future. And so we can't really look to the past or to our existing holdings. What lives in our data warehousing, for example, is not really that helpful necessarily when you look at some of the major resets we've had, whether it's a pandemic or anything else that faces us in the future. So if it doesn't live there, how are we going to use those resources to provide more scenario modelled, more environmental scanning, more strategic assessment around what will work to get better regulatory compliance outcomes across a range of stakeholders where we understand the context of all of those systems and something about that context in terms of how it's changing. So without accurate data and information, I'm using that term quite expansively, there's no way we can stay ahead of those emerging trends and patterns. We get further and further behind, and we run a risk of entrenching some old thinking, some old habits, and some old institutional sort of beliefs and paradigms that are not fit for purpose.
And we'll come back to that point, because I think that's an absolutely killer point, that sort of hard-coded dodginess potentially that could be sitting in the system. Put it to you, and welcome, I guess, from the lens that you've looked at it, and we've spoken offline in terms of the work that you're doing. How does all this resonate?
Oh, kia ora koutou katoa. From hearing some of the speakers this morning, there's quite a strong treaty aspect in what does partnership look like. So a part of my mahi is actually trying to look at an evidence. How is data going to be able to deliver on a treaty partnership, for example? And so I've been looking at equity measures within the regulatory system and looking at ways that we can put measures within the regulatory system to determine if there is a disproportionate amount of Māori within that particular regulatory system. And what we've found is that most regulatory systems are not working well for Māori in those situations, which is really quite problematic, because the reason why the regulatory system was developed in the first place was to help the most vulnerable, was to create compliance standards so that our most vulnerable will be able to transact in that regulatory system and would be able to create wealth for themselves in that space as well. But what we've found is that Māori are missing, and they are disproportionately in very small numbers in those regulatory systems. So what are we not doing well? So by putting in the measures in place, we can then hone in where, particularly we're working on the insolvency regulatory system at the moment, of what is happening in that service delivery and actually shining a light on it, and what can we change. We may be able to change the service delivery to a certain extent, but maybe we have to change the legislation as well, and we have to go back to our ministers and tell them the narrative of what's actually happening.
Because if it's a frame of reference that's not quite right, Māori's missing,
That's right.
I guess we're asking ourselves the wrong questions.
That's right.
Yeah, no, and speaking of questions, thanks members of the audience, keep pumping them in. I've got one, and it's from my boss's boss, so I'm going to do it first. I liked it anyway. Can you offer any examples of regulators that are really good at using data to make risk-based decisions, and how did they get good? This is a kind of fantasy football league, isn't it? Who would you want playing? Who's your fantasy football kind of, data regulators of choice, apart from yourselves, of course? Any starters? Thinking there.
Talking to other regulators, I think I might just call out some of the work that's been done in the regional sector with LAWA, Land, Air, Water, Aotearoa. And that's a partnership between regional councils, Ministry for the Environment, and I think it's Cawthorne Institute or another CRI, where all of the regional councils have got together and created a platform, a website, where they share their environmental monitoring data. I use this when I'm going for a run along the waterfront here, and I'm like, can I jump in the harbour afterwards? So you can go on and you can check the latest environmental data. And that's consistent across the whole country. And so I think it's really interesting seeing how different regional councils have got together with a single platform like that. I'm really looking forward to, and our role as a very new regulator, to be involved in some sort of similar platforms like that.
But no harbour jumping.
I think last time I checked, it's still safe.
Okay.
I think it probably needs a bit more oversight of wastewater.
Gotcha. Yeah, subject to that messy point. See you out there afterwards. What about you, Jacqui? Any kind of case studies, or I guess focuses of choice, work you've seen outside your own agency, or indeed inside, that you could say that's actually model of its kind, something that I'd look to?
Yeah, this is a really tough question, and I'm going to put a case example out there that might be a little bit contentious, but okay. I want to acknowledge the work that was done in the MIQ system. That was stood up incredibly quickly, and it needed to place some regulatory controls around some things that were quite difficult politically, and really challenge the amount of government control, in terms of people's general liberty, and we all know how that went. But in terms of the function and the regulatory system that was built around that, and I'll talk from a data point of view, what we achieved in that space, I say we, there were so many agencies and including private contractors who had input from the MIQ facilities and places like that. It was really quite a collaborative effort around the combination of data elements to provide insight into how that was working. It wasn't always perfect, and we know that it was designed in a hurry. But in the end, we were able to safely share information across a complete border picture, including border forecasting, MIQ capacity, right down to security provision, customer feedback, survey results, information from the portal, what were travellers' intentions. All of that was living in one place where it could be analysed to understand how things were operating across the whole of that system. I mean, it took a while to build, and some things didn't go perfectly. However, the innovation that came in that exercise was really fantastic in terms of finding ways to share that information, finding ways to reconcile different kinds of information, so not just a data picture, but queries across qualitative sources, and then quite quickly getting to a point where that could be assessed in context to provide advice instead of just raw data numbers. So I think that was quite a good effort in the timeframes and given the size of that challenge.
I was going to say, I mean, you'd have been proceeding at speed and under urgency on that one.
Absolutely.
And to what extent did you find, you know, as we all did in this room, I suspect that COVID traumatized us into actions that perhaps in a pre-COVID environment, while proper within it, during COVID previously would have been unthinkable?
Sorry.
Would some of the work that was done in that project have even been thinkable at that sort of speed before COVID? Was it one of those kind
it's not just the speed. I think it's the opportunities to start from a relatively blank sheet of paper.
Yeah.
You're not trying to retrofit insight questions across existing data sets.
Yeah.
You're freer to ask when you're solving the problem, who has information that I can use to inform the advice that we need to provide, or the design of this public interface, or the experience that someone has. You know, because it was all new, and because we had a mandate to collect that information and to use it in a cross-agency, including with private businesses and including from information from the users of the system all at once as we designed it, you get a much better result. And as a single system or in a single agency, you don't often get that opportunity. So I think it was more about asking the right question and doing the right data collection piece at the start, and not having to retrofit but based on, you know, a whole lot of institutional understandings or poor data.
It is asking the right questions, Puti. I mean, that's your point, isn't it, really? Asking the correct preliminary questions. What would you put up as a model of its kind in some of the work that you've seen in terms of data collection? Or potentially, and again, I know we both saw what Lil said earlier and had a chat offline about it, in terms of the imperative that she looks to promote across with her colleagues, just in terms of getting the approach to data collection right.
Yep, absolutely. I think first I was also agreeing with what Michael was saying. Yeah. A joined-up approach is really essential to enable us to understand what are the innovative aspects of what we can achieve. And I suppose the difficulty with Māori ethnicity data is that we have to have a standard way or consistent way of reporting ethnicity data, and we're now adopting within MB the New Zealand Stats standard, which is really great. But there's lots of issues that go with that, which is a bit of a turbulent past as well, where data has been used and abused, and policies have been developed in assumptions that actually don't deliver well for Māori. Actually, it goes exactly the opposite. Yeah. So that's very problematic. Yeah. So we have to use it, and we have to be careful about how we do use the data, especially when we're collecting ethnicity data. But it is imperative that we do have it, because how can we say that we have equity within our regulatory system if we're not able to determine where Māori are in the regulatory system to make those services better, or to change legislation? Because if they're not there at present, then the question has to be asked why, and we have to change it. We can't just go with the status quo at the moment. And the other thing is, I guess, if you go the wrong way, you end up unintentionally or recklessly hard-coding discrimination into a system as a frame of reference left around for future generations to deal with. The records may not be clear of that, and they're saddled with something they think's decent, and it's not. Jacqui, I think is that something that you sort of have had a concern about?
Definitely. I think when you look at the algorithm charter and its intentions and the broader applicability of that, it's got a very broad definition. And if you were to consider all of the business processes you use internally that somehow triage risk or identify risk groups based on weighted criteria models or different kind of risk identification processes, almost all of those things will be reflecting back previous decision bias, an incomplete data set in terms of what the risk really looks like. And it sets a platform where you are systemically disenfranchising a group of people, even if you're just asking them repeatedly for more information or taking a bit longer to process something, or maybe they have an adverse outcome or a decline rate or something that's different. And so, you know, when that's happened, if you were to try to speed up your business process or make it faster, or whether your automated decision-making is a word I try and stay away from, in favour of augmented, where you're providing the right information at those critical moments, there's a huge pressure to process this information faster and to sort of get the optimised speed of processing. But if you overlay that sort of calculation in any regard across a data set that has those issues, you will simply speed up the transaction rate and hard code those issues into your system. It's very, very hard to retrofit a more balanced perspective without spending a lot of time and energy proactively collecting in the gaps, if you like, or restructuring your data. And so getting an investment case to go and do that and to restructure all of those, what it would take to do that is quite time consuming and requires a bit of investment for the business to do. So we're certainly finding that the pressure to speed up processing rates, and it doesn't really matter what your regulatory system is or even your decision, or even to optimise your targeting sort of further up the Braithwaite triangle and identify lower and high risk categories. If that's being built on a data platform that's not appropriate, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to unwind.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's a search for the clean slate. Michael, one for you, I think. The action word we're talking about here, are we talking, asked one of the audience, about data-driven regulation or data-informed regulation, given the discussion we've been having on asking the right preliminary questions? Was that splitting hairs?
No, it definitely isn't. And I'm wondering if that's from one of my colleagues, because I've definitely had this conversation.
Someone you know.
I think it's definitely data-informed. To say it's data-driven, I think is, I actually tried to get the name of the panel changed, Ian. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. Data is only ever going to be part of the picture. We're never going to have complete data about everything. And I think a lot of the time you'll get technologists, I certainly was in that boat a few years ago, I think we just need to measure it, model it, and manage it. And I think the worlds that we operate in are so complex and are so rapidly changing and responding to what we do. They respond to what we measure. So by the time we've modeled it and we try and manage it, the target's moved. So we can only ever hope to be data informed. And I certainly think that's something we should aim to be. We should be looking at multiple data sources. We should be looking at the data which is easy to get. We should be looking at how we can automate that. And then we should be looking at how we complement that with other data sources, which may be much harder to manage, and also make sure that there's always a human in the loop at some stage to make sure that the decisions we're making still align with our values.
And I guess as a new regulator, we've had the boss in year one. What's the challenge for you as looking after the data and being the kind of, Bill did the description of the peak and the sort of the apex of learning and where all the data lives. But is it really more cogs on the right-hand side of his graph? And I appreciate politics might just prevent you from sort of going into the weeds, but I guess generically, what are the challenges in that kind of new setup?
I see mostly opportunities. The challenges are the sheer amount of opportunities to be taken advantage of, if that's a politically...
Yeah, that's a very upbeat and optimistic way to look at it. Puti, I'm going to go to you because I think it's something that you've touched upon, but slightly different. What does the future, one of our questions asks, of Māori data sovereignty look like for regulators? And I guess in terms of, it's a big subject, I appreciate, in terms not just of perhaps the approach, but almost the sort of a generic attitude and automatic biases that I think you've touched upon implicitly in your concerns about existing data regimes.
Big question. Well, I think I go back to the treaty and think that's an amazing document that really guides us in a purpose of why we need to collect equity data, why we need to collect ethnicity data. We need to make that comparison, and that is very much a treaty obligation that we need to follow through with. So I do think that is the right step. One of the first maybe baby steps in actually delivering an evidence-based treaty partnership approach, which our regulatory systems do need to be able to deliver on. With that said, there's some awesome, once we're sort of understanding that we can actually change this regulatory system, we can change the service, we can actually do quite a lot in the service delivery to enable Māori to enter into those spaces, then what we can begin to see is the emerging iwi groups who are doing fantastic exemplar business opportunities. They're working with overseas, they're looking at what is a better way to work with our migrants. How can we create pastoral care, enable them to come into our fold and deliver one of the best hospitality industries in the world.
Yes.
So those opportunities are going to come through as we begin changing our regulatory system, and as Māori and iwi groups are informing us on how we can actually improve our regulatory system. And it happens at two ends, like I've said. It's at the service delivery. We can make quite a lot of change in that service delivery space, but we can also say those stories and talk to our minister and say, actually, this is the story that this iwi, maybe ngāta, who want to explain. How can we make the changes in that legislation to meet their needs? Because, they're thinking big picture now.
Yeah.
It's no longer just keeping to Aotearoa. So I think there's huge opportunities in the future, and it's looking much brighter than it was just even 10 years ago.
But which is good, but what do we need to do to sort of get on with that? Is it asking ourselves more of a right preliminary questions in terms of thresholds?
Well, I think it's a little bit iterative because we don't really know what the future pathway looks like.
Yeah.
We're starting early on. We're looking at equity measures as a baby step, looking at that space. We're looking at changes. The next step is changing to service delivery, maybe changes to some regulation. And I think then the picture's begun to be formed, and we're going to see a brighter, bigger picture where iwi are going to be key participants of that picture, whereas I don't think we see that as much at the moment.
No, it's getting the right people in, and I think it derives from what I call, in the nicest of ways, cries for help from three of our audience, and the questions are there any work programs in the pipe that will give training to enhance or promote the use of data analytics? That's limb 1. You don't know what you don't know, so how do we know where there isn't data but there could be serious harm, or whether data is dirty? And also, again, what insights do you have to help us confidently regulate when input data can be messy and full? So you got 10 minutes to sort this all out.
Can you start with one of those?
I think wrapped all up, it's a sort of what's the 101 on this? If I'm not necessarily a data practitioner,
right,
but I'm a manager, I'm thinking strategically in the way in which 280 of our audience will be, because that's why they're here. I either deal with data or someone reports to me who does. What are the sort of preliminary approaches that I should be making? I could be reporting to a minister, I could be assisting in the framing of policy derived from data-based information and insight. Where do I kind of start? What are the kind of housekeeping tips, Michael?
I can tell a bit of a story about a project we're working on at the moment. So as a new regulator, we've just released the drinking water quality assurance rules. Those came into effect last week, I think it was. And that's a 97-page document with some very prescriptive rules of what drinking water suppliers need to do to treat and test and monitor their water supplies. And this includes a lot of reporting requirements of what they need to report to us. And I pointed out that based on these rules, we could end up with a stack of paper taller than the building we're in. It's about a 14-story building. So what we've been doing is taking a bit of a rules as code approach to this. We've broken that document down into a list of 300 different rules. It can be filterable so that different sizes of water suppliers know what they need to report through to us. These water suppliers, a lot of them are very sophisticated operations, a lot of them are not. And so they have systems where they have online monitors that measure the pH, the turbidity of water. They have labs, systems that look at the E. coli measurements, the nitrate measurements. And we've been having conversations with some of the software providers of these and talking about setting up a data standard. And we're going to target engagement around this data standard. So we're saying this is exactly the data that we want sent through automatically from your systems. And I use that word slightly apprehensively because we also want to make sure the water suppliers are taking responsibility for that. So it is something that they actually have to click a button and say, yes, I'm supporting I'm sending this through to the regulator. So we're in the midst of building this at the moment. We're hoping to go live early next year. But what I'm hoping we get from this is a large amount of structured data that we can come through.
Yeah.
We can automatically verify that against the rules that we've codified.
Yeah.
And we're able to then do reporting on that. And that's just part of the picture. And that hopefully makes a whole bunch of stuff really easy. And so we can focus on the more nuanced understanding, which can't be easily automated.
No, so there's almost there's a filter system that comes through as a matter of hygiene straight away. When you're dealing with somewhere that looks after, give or take, 11 regulatory systems, Jacqui, how do you deal with that?
I think just to follow on from the first question and hopefully to answer this, there's probably three things that I would do. The first one is establish an effective working relationship with your key decision maker group, whoever that is, at whatever level that is. You need to intimately understand what they need to be informed about. You know, is it an operational level decision? Is it policy advice? Understand what their need is. What is their big insight question? Then I would design a minimum viable data product, if you like. You know, what do you need to invest in from a data point of view to produce the data you need to answer that question, and nothing else? And the reason I say that is because there's so much data out there, and with these cloud tools even, it's very, very tempting, like your iPhone storage, to just store more and more and more data, and that's going to come at a huge cost in the future around licensing and storage, transaction rates, and all the rest. And you're probably going to find you can't even identify or manage most of that. So just get a value stream against that decision maker requirement that's really tight on the data scope. And then I would add a multidisciplinary approach and other analytical methods to contextualize that data result. So use your research, your evaluation, your intelligence, your open source stuff, your comms material to give you the sort of context we heard in the Futures presentation around that data piece, because no decision maker can really make a decision of any number, even a really clever predictive one, without a story. And so you need to build that out and then get that whole piece working, and then just piece by piece build out an information or service, if you like, that's bespoke to that decision maker requirement. But it's part of our roles, I think, as insight leaders to create that relationship and land the product back to a table that will make a difference, you know, where the product will have a difference, whether it's because they understand something more than they did before, or it's going to actually inform a decision. If you can't execute it, it's a waste of time. It's a lot of wasted effort.
And the key word, I think, and it's come from one of you members of the audience, is story. And I think that is, and that's what I think we've heard. It's, I was putting one of a question, qualitative foresight and quantitative forecasting, story and data. What Melissa was talking about was the story, and the sort of data was underneath it, but it's actually the story which involves our communications colleagues, which involves the minister, potentially. It involves, let's talk about this, the policy regulatory relationship, where we're looking to promote reform where data is used in support, and the assumptions that underscore that. That's an old chestnut we get in the sort of regulatory circuits about, you know, talking to policy, and is there a parapet between us? The general answer is no, but there are some who think, well, maybe there's still a few bits of bricks and mortar. How does data help knock the wall down?
Well, in the treaty space, I suppose we haven't actually really had an evidence-based approach, and that has been missing.
Yeah.
So I think in the treaty space, we are just starting now to look at evidence. What does equity look like in an evidence-based measured? How can we measure that we are delivering on equity according to the treaty, which, you know, we all as agencies are committed to?
Yes.
So in that regard, in that space, we're just starting now. And that's really imperative, because once we gather that evidence, it adds to the stories that we get told by the managers or the service deliverers about what is actually happening in that particular regulatory. And we can tell those stories, and those stories actually speak quite widely to wide populations, to ministers who can make the changes as they see necessary, to the policymakers who see, oh, well, I didn't understand it. Now I know why that particular policy wasn't working, so we need to be able to change it. So, you know, having those conversations and those narrative types of conversations are really quite crucial to make the change.
And does the idea of it being canvassed to story make a difference to transmission? Because I've got a question. It says Māori data is very hard to access. How can we create regulation that protect Māori values when the policymakers have very little access to it? I think Puti partly dealt with it, but it's kind of, is it the fact that the data is hard to access, but again, giving the backstory and the purpose for the use of the data makes the transmission more palatable and easy and kind of rational, rather than, you know, this is big government stomping around, we want some numbers?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, I think. And that there hasn't been a consistent approach, for example, for ethnicity gathering, of ethnicity reporting rather. So that's created a sort of an inconsistency. So we can't compare, you know, because it's apples and pears, we can't compare that. And then on the other side, of it, there has been a bit of a history of bad policy, and that bad policy has created quite a lot of barriers for Māori, and it's actually been quite destructive. In the back of my mind, I always think about when you can have, it seems that the policy might be a subtle difference, but it can actually have a huge violation effect for Māori.
Yes.
And so that's not well understood between a policy that might be as subtle as creating, I don't know, there was a situation I know where they just created a gate where they couldn't access the waterway.
Yeah.
But what that eventuated was that they were sourcing water, and it was causing huge violations to Māori and to their health and their well-being.
Yeah.
So those understandings need to be really, the implications of the policy need to be better understood.
And I think, and obviously very sensitive areas, Michael, also given what the Chief Exec was saying earlier, areas that automatically resonate with your agency's work in terms of the collection and use of data, and possibly the system in which our agency operates.
Yeah, and I mean, not all data is created equal, and not all data should be treated equally. Some
Yeah.
data can be easily collected, as I was talking about before, but we're also very aware that, and I use the word, I don't even think data is the right word, but some of the mātauranga, some of the whakapapa, some of the purakao, which are all relevant to our sort of regulatory intelligence landscape, those need to be treated with much more care and much differently. I think when I think about data, I think immediately, instinctively going to what can we collect at a national level. But a lot of this, a lot of sort of Māori data is much more localized. And when we look at Te Mana o Te Wai, one of the key parts of that is to have a holistic view of water, but also to respect that there's different sort of local knowledge about water, and it needs to be managed in a different way locally. So I think it's one of the challenges that we need to face of how do we bring this all together, and a lot of it will come back down to relationships.
Yes, and Jacqui, I can telepathically see that you're about to say something. Relationships are everything, I think, is what you were going to answer the question on.
Relationships and having the right people involved and making sure there is space for everyone to be involved.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of ideas, really. I mean, it might be in the future that government shouldn't aspire to own all the data or to own the interpretation of it in the name of providing evidence. You know, evidence can be really useful. I mean, I think part of it has come, from my perspective anyway, what I've seen, the evidence discussion has come out of a desire to mitigate anecdotal or other sort of biased views. You know, if we can get to an objective or more scientific truth, then that's a value in our decision making. Yeah. Or, you know, maybe there are scientifically provable facts about the world that we want to be able to show underpinned our decision.
Yeah.
Whether it's any good for an intervention logic approach across how and why people do things in a system is another matter completely. And so when we're asking, you know, this is more about behavioural insights, or, you know, who are the key relationships that we need to have so they can tell their story about the how and why things are happening. And then, you know, the data that may substantiate that might live other places. What I've seen in terms of the globalisation, when you look at social media and looking at patterns of deviance and behaviour and sentiment, that's a completely different sort of analysis and data set that government doesn't have, but is hugely informative about how and why people do things. And it might be we need to look at this data democratisation piece and the technology piece quite differently in the future to get a better story about what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, does it matter where it lives, Michael? As long as it's kosher, we can use it, and we don't upset anyone. Does it? Why?
Absolutely. The treaty, if we move away from government agencies, there's no protection for Māori under the treaty.
Okay.
So that's actually quite a fundamental issue.
Yep.
Unless we look at constitutional reform,
yep.
And that, you know, that would be a different, completely another, it's opening up like another can of worms to cope with it. So, sorry, I just had to butt in there because I thought that was imperative.
It's important. So from that perspective, it's central, you'd say, that it's within government. If there's a safe third-party source, it doesn't work.
No, because the same obligations, those third parties don't necessarily have the same obligations to the treaty. The treaty is between the Crown and Māori.
Yeah.
I should clarify, I meant inside the regulatory agency.
Okay.
The regulatory agency doesn't have to own it. Yeah.
Okay. Contracting out, Michael, what do you say? No, that's good.
I think it's also really interesting to think our roles are regulators, not managers. So ultimately, it comes down, in my case, it's water supplies. We want them to be managing the safety of their own water supply. That's their responsibility. So who needs the data? In a respect, it needs to sit with them. And one of the things we're thinking about when it comes to engaging with kāinga, Māori water supplies, is how can we use data as a koha? So it's not about taking data from them, but actually saying, look, we know we have a bunch of data on a national level. Here is the data that we have. How can you use that data and add it to your own data, your own knowledge, to improve the quality of your water? And so I think it's really interesting to maybe flip that model around.
That's an awesome idea. Right.
And so we get actually to not just the nature of the data, but intrinsically the cultural and behavioural approach of the Crown, of the government, before it even sets foot on what sort of questions it should be asking. Here are some house rules. You just don't do it any other way, and then ask the question. So there's almost a preliminary kind of question about how we do. Let's just take a pause. We're going to head off. We're going to get you some caffeine in a minute, members of the audience. I see you're flagging, but yeah, I can see you're also engaged. Shall we have some analogue questions? Someone want to stand up with a microphone and do a Mick Jagger? Hands up. Any questions? I know you give me about 15 on here. Thank you. Anyone got anything to ask or confess or to or anything else? All right. Well, I'm going to just quickly canter through the panel before we say thank you with just some final thoughts in a word or two. What are your kind of messages to the audience, having asked what they've asked and having heard what they've heard? Any final thoughts in your own time?
I agree with what Michael just said, is that actually we can give the data to Māori and make them the determinators of their own future. And I think that we've still got some way to go to do that, but I think that's an exciting and innovative future that we can look forward to.
Love it.
So, yeah, that's my final comment.
My final comment would be really in support of the presentation we had earlier. You know, we are in really dramatically changing times, and that cadence is increasing, and we hear that a lot. Don't be afraid to scenario model off a completely new base around where you're going and how you're going to plan your regulatory system into the future, including what data holdings you need to create something really fit for purpose. That could be a faster and cheaper way of doing it than trying to work from where you are right now.
I would just push back on something Grant said earlier about having boffins in the back office. I think reference to technology. Sure, you can put us in the back office and we can put our hoodies on and chin up reports for you. But I think we get a lot better outcome when we're actually working together. Technologists know what's possible with technology. You know your needs, the constraints of regulatory systems. There's things that we can't do with technology, and I think there's a huge amount of opportunity that we have now. And I guess just a quote from William Gibson, you mentioned snow crash before, and it's the future is here. It's not evenly distributed. So think about what we can actually do with the things that we have at the moment if we just piece them together in the right way.
And of course, this one's going to dive out at 4:30 into the Harbour App meeting. Puti, Jacqui, and Michael, you've been awesome. Thank you very much.